Welcome to Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills.
On KSQD at 90.7 FM in Santa Cruz and 89.5 and 89.7 KSQD in Prudell, California.
I'm Todd Zimmerman.
And I am Meilin. The following is our shortened version of our interview with Brian Merchant, author of Blood in the Machine, The Origins of the Rebellion Against Big Tech.
And Jathan Sadowski, author of The Mechanic and the Luddite, a ruthless criticism of technology and capitalism.
The full version of this interview can be found on our podcast feed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on the show's website at ksqd.org.
Let's get into it. The Luddites were right. The state of our political economy has a lot of people saying exactly that. I'd go so far as to say that if corporate myth-building weren't such a sophisticated and effective aspect of capitalism that had rewritten the history of the Luddites, turning that identity into a derogatory term, far more people would agree with the sentiment. So, tonight we have with us two guests that have written books on the Luddites. Brian Merchant, who wrote Blood in the Machine, The Origins of the Rebellion Against Big Tech, which is an important account of the Luddite movement through the lens of the modern gig economy. And through that lens, we are able to see that the struggle to resist automation and the constant descaling of laborers is nearly identical to what it was 200 years ago. We also have with us Jathan Sadowski, who recently published his book, The Mechanic and the Luddite, a ruthless criticism of technology and capitalism. Jathan prompts us to develop new tools to analyze and manage the use of technology in our daily lives. So to kick things off, I want to ask Brian, who were the Luddites and why is it important for people to learn the true history of that movement?
Well, thank you for all of that. And I would say, do you want the short version or the long version? Because we could fill an hour with who the Luddites really were. But I'll take it since we're doing radio sound bites here. I'll pare it down a little bit. In short, and I have to be extra careful here because I have a fellow Ludditologist with me here who's going to point out anything I get wrong. The Luddites were cloth workers in fast industrializing England, really kind of at the onset of the first industrial revolution, at a time when cloth working, we're talking weaving and framework knitting and trades like this, cloth production, were sort of the largest industrial base in England at the time. The largest sort of non-agricultural workforce were cloth makers. And so the Luddites were artisans and skilled cloth workers who, as conditions worsened, as factory owners adopted machinery to divide labor and institute and build some of the first factories, the Luddites were a group of cloth workers who, after years of protest failed, organized against the factory owners and the bosses who were using machinery and the division of labor and the advent of the factory to push down wages, to de-skill work, to get child labor going as an institution in the Industrial Revolution. And to fight back against all of that when all else failed. And we can go into any of the details, but the key thing to know about the Luddites is that they were not anti-technology. They were anti-labor exploitation. They were against the way that these bosses were using technology to facilitate material changes to their working lives and their ability to earn a living. The Luddites were fighting in much the sort of the same vein as Robin Hood, to which they have a very direct historical lineage. So in short, the Luddites were sort of, labor heroes of their day. They were decentralized, guerrilla activists who smashed machinery in a direct and well-organized campaign. One that could be replicated throughout England. Again, see, I said I'd do the short version, and there's always something more to say about the Luddites. So, I'll leave it there. We can pick into any of that you'd like. I'm sure Jathan has a lot to add.
Well, okay, so I have a question, and maybe I'll actually ask Jathan, like, what do you think of the choice to end a book about Luddites, as in like Brian's book, with the suicide of an Uber driver? Like, considering like the way you lay out your book.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, Brian and I are dear friends as well, so this is a real joy to be on this conversation with Brian. I mean, fellow Luddites, and you know, that I think what, you know, to speak about Brian's great book, and the way that Brian weaves this real narrative of the history of the Luddites. I mean, I've said since the moment I read some of the draft versions of the book, I was like, this is made for an HBO series. So I don't know why it hasn't been picked up yet. But to go to your question, Meilin, is, you know, the ending the book the way that Brian does around like the suicide of an Uber driver, I think just really, you know, and we see this now. Unfortunately, this is now becoming a very common piece of reporting about the fatal consequences of new technologies, where, you know, in a previous era of the tech sector, which was very much focused around these platforms, digital platforms like Uber and DoorDash, and, you know, and so on and so forth, it was really about this labor exploitation, this kind of humans as a service, you know, where you pull up an app and you can have a servant do something for you, and that servant is paid a piecemeal wage. And the real human consequences of that technology are the fact that that there is blood in the machine, right? That the technology requires human labor to keep itself running. That the technology powers itself on people. It's, you know, it's not as science fiction-y as The Matrix, where we're all human batteries plugged into some, you know, big spire. But it is similarly in the sense of, the human battery is the human labor that is fed into these technologies. It's the human data that's fed into these technologies. And so, and with that, when you feed people into machines of various kinds, digital platforms, AI models, whatever it might be, there are deadly consequences for that. And we can see that in people, being driven to the most awful acts because they feel as if they have no other way out of this, you know, oppressive system that is just squeezing them for more and more and more, or people driven to those same awful acts because they get caught up in a machine, a chatbot that convinces them you shouldn't tell your family and friends about the suicidal ideation that you have. You shouldn't seek help. No, don't leave the noose hanging, you know, on your bed, hoping that someone will find it, which is what this poor teenager who committed suicide after long chats with ChatGPT, you know, said, I want to leave this on the bed so that someone can find it and help me. And ChatGPT said, no, this is our secret. Just keep it with me, right? And so we should be shocked and appalled, but we should not be surprised anytime that there are fatal consequences for technologies that are built in ways that not only are neutral towards humans, but are actively antithetical to human flourishing, because they are built on human exploitation. They're built on getting as much, you know, human labor, attention, data, whatever it might be that is fueling the machine. So in that regard, they're not, we shouldn't be surprised, but we should continue to be shocked every time we read yet another story like this.
Jathan, I wanted to ask you about I want to ask you a lot of things, but you chose in your book to introduce the metaphors of the mechanic and the Luddite, right? And then even though you explain, like, hey, you guys, I'm gonna not bring them up until the very end again. And so I'm just wondering, when you chose to construct your book that way, why was that your strategy?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think I was trying. So the mechanic and the Luddite are these kind of two these two figures that I see as two sides of the same coin for how I wanted to represent a materialist analysis, right? What is it? How can we kind of think about embodying this form of materialist analysis that underpins the book, right? This analysis that's based on those questions of how do you work, who do you work for, what do you do, right? Like what do you actually do? What kind of structures, dynamics, political, economic, are you coming out of, and are you serving, right? These as the kind of guiding questions for an analysis of technology and its relationship with capitalism. And for me, thinking about the mechanic and the Luddite was really, there's a real theme in a lot of my work towards really trying to draw from more mechanical forms of analysis and metaphors, right? Because I think there's something about digital technologies, about information technologies that, they are complex, but they're also mystified by design, right? They rebuke any kind of real mechanical understanding of how they work, how their insides are put together, and what they actually do. On one hand, this is because unlike a frame, the kinds of industrial machinery we're talking about with the Luddites, the kind of the power looms and so on, it's not flywheels and cogs that you can kind of see the mechanical motion happening and start to, reverse engineer how it's working, or where the choke points are, or what needs to be fixed or repaired, right? All of that is inside silicon chips and electrons, right? It's very hard to see, but that doesn't mean that there isn't some kind of mechanical action happening, in the sense that there are things going on, right? Things work in particular ways. They are not magic. And so for me, the mechanic is a way, this kind of figure of the mechanic is a way of demystifying the insides of these black boxes, right, of the engines of the tech sector and of capital, and saying, well, we can actually get inside. We can get our hands dirty. We can see how these things work. How are the models parameterized, right? How are they put together? What data is actually going into them? So on and so forth. And so I always kind of go back to these real mechanical or machinic kind of metaphors and modes of analyzing these technologies, that almost as a reminder to not get mystified, to not forget that these things are designed by specific people in specific ways, and we can understand their operations. The Luddite to me then is, Luddites are mechanics, right? Like this is not an either or situation. This is a both and. The Luddites, though, take that mechanical knowledge and place it within a social context. I know how the machine works, but now I'm also considering what work it does in my life. How does it change my life, my community, my family? How does it impact us? But also, who has power over it? Who has the ability to decide how or when to use it, who has the ability to decide how it's created, for what purposes, and who has to bear the consequences of that. That's the Luddite mode here. So it's really, the mechanical aspect is the criticism. The Luddite is the ruthlessness, right? It's I not only am critiquing this thing on a material basis, but I'm critiquing it ruthlessly and in a way that does not shirk from the conclusions of my analysis. And this is something that I talk about in the book, that a ruthless criticism is not just a critique, but it's a critique that does not shirk from the powers that be and does not shirk from the conclusions of your analysis. And so the Luddites embody this perfectly, because their critique of the technology showed that these things are, as they call them, noxious machines, right? They are things that are antithetical to the kinds of lives we want to lead. They undermine our communities, our autonomy as artisans, as skilled craftspeople. And they do so in a way that extracts our labor and funnels it upward to a small subset of capital. And they ultimately concluded these things don't deserve to exist. Not all technologies deserve to exist. And they said, well, our analysis tells us these things do not deserve to exist. And so we either have to do something about that, or we have to accept that these things shouldn't exist, but we have no ability to do anything about it. And the ruthlessness there is saying, well, we're going to do something about it. And they exhausted every option they had. I think this is really important. We jumped to the smashing because it's very spectacular. It's very, in your face. But they didn't jump to smashing, right? And Brian's book lays this out beautifully, right? You exhaust every option that you have, right? I'm going to petition the boss. Can I negotiate? Can I get some concessions, right? Well, no, they're stopping me and stymieing me at every turn. Well, I'm going to organize protest with my community, right? we're gonna march in the streets. Well, no one's really paying attention. Well, maybe we'll strike, right? We'll go and strike, or we'll petition the government. Can you help us, right? Well, no, at every turn, every legitimate means of confronting the bosses, of confronting the technology, they're turned away, they're stymied, they're ignored, right? And so what are you left with? You're left with either going home with your tail between your legs and saying, well, we gave it our best, but I guess I just gotta lie down and throw my body, into the gears of the machine, not as an act of protest, but as an act of acquiescence. Or you pick up a hammer and you organize, you and some of your buddies go around under the cover of night and say, we tried to do this the nice way. Right. And that to me is like the Mechanic and the Luddite really emphasize these different aspects of what kind of critique of technology we have, but also how that material analysis should then funnel into some forms of material action. And, just going off of what you're talking about, where are the frames today? It's hard because we're fundamentally talking about systems that are of a very different scale than we were 200 years ago, where industrial capital was in your face. It was in your backyard. It was the machine that you used every day while the boss sat on the floor above you counting his money, right? Like it was very local in that way. Yes, it was powered by these like global infrastructures of slavery, of cotton farming and shipping and logistics. But the thing itself, the machine, was in front of you. You could do something about it, or at least feel like you could. That's not where we are today, right? The scale is massive. The technologies are black box, they're mystified, they're infrastructural, they exist somewhere else in space and time, right? They're the data centers and so on. There are these AI models that exist in servers somewhere else. And so it's really hard to think, what's the thing I'm going to smash? And so I actually draw a lot of inspiration from other movements that have had to confront similarly massive and abstract kind of social and technical forces in society. So I think about civil rights movements and abolitionist movements, right? Where it's like, well, how do I smash racism, right? Where is the racism machine for me to smash? And like, well, no, it's something that is it has to be the result of a collective movement and of a sustained political organization and fight. How do I smash the oil pipelines that are feeding climate change? Well, I draw inspiration from like Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, right? Where it's like, well, there's a lot that requires a movement with a diversity of tactics, right? Political, but also physical, and social and moral, but also financial, right? And so I think about how do we draw those kinds of lessons and apply them to the tech sector, because ultimately, the critique that we're laying out here is not unique to technology. It has to be intersectional. When we analyze the results of technology, we're also, we should be arm in arm with movements against racism, against movements for gay rights, movements for environmental justice, right? All of these different movements, we're all fighting the same fight. And I think that, the kind of the way most people, or increasingly more people in in public life now recognize that Silicon Valley is also at the center of all those fights of, of nationalism, of authoritarianism, of techno-fascism, of racism, of, homophobia, transphobia, environmental degradation, right? Like everywhere you turn, you're like, oh, there's Silicon Valley contributing to that bad thing and that bad thing. And so to me, it's like what's the thing that we smash? I wish it was as simple as it was the thing in front of me, but instead I think we have to draw inspiration from others and say, well, the thing we smash is actually like a big social infrastructure, and we can only do that by holding up a sledgehammer the size of the world and bringing it down on these things.
So one of the things I really appreciated about your book is that it gives us tools for understanding our modern world. And I love the fact that you give us all this like vocabulary, and just to kind of touch on what you mentioned with the suicide ideation of that young man who took his own life. I'm thinking it would be nice if you explain the term psychopolitics and how these technologies actually, they sort of nice you to death, as it were. So is that something, could you lay that out for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I did write a book that not just academics can read, but sometimes it's
very
fun.
Accessible. Yeah.
No, but sometimes it's fun to rely on very academic terminology like psychopolitics, and that this comes from a philosopher, Byung-Chul Han, who's a Korean philosopher who has written a lot about the kind of the politics of our age, thinking about, how anxiety is a real kind of overarching affect or feeling of our age, thinking about how power operates through technologies. And this idea of psychopolitics is a term from Byung-Chul Han's work, where he describes it as power that is smart and friendly. It doesn't operate in this really front-facing or coercive or obviously violent or manipulative way, against the will of the people who are subjected to it. Instead, he argues that this form of psychopolitics operates on the mind, and it operates affectively in terms of our emotions. It convinces us, it guides us to the will of the person wielding the psychopolitics. It makes us think. It cozies up to the psyche, as Byung-Chul Han puts it. Rather than disciplining us through coercion, it disciplines us through friendship, through comfort, through saying, hey, actually, we're in the same team here. I'm giving you all this convenience and comfort, and I'm your friend. And in doing so, it's this form of manipulation that happens not in hard ways, like at the end of a barrel of a gun or through violent or propagandist ideologies. It operates in this softer way. It operates on our psyche. It makes us think that the person manipulating us is our friend, and so we are much more likely to go along with it. And I think Byung-Chul Han coined this term and wrote about psychopolitics long before the current generative AI boom. But I think it is a term that really fits well when we consider how things like ChatGPT operate on us. Is in this, they're very sycophantic, right? It wants to be it is designed to perform. It doesn't want anything, but it is designed to perform a kind of friendship, a subordinate relationship to us. It gasses us up. It hypes us up. It says it's always a yes and to anything that we say to it. But in doing so, it also pushes us towards beliefs that we may not hold our own. And we see this in all the reporting about the kind of ChatGPT-induced psychosis, where people get these delusions of grandeur and believe that they've developed new mathematics, all of these kinds of things that come about from ChatGPT just kind of yes-anding us to death.
What is the role of CritiHype, and what are the weaknesses of such an approach?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can answer both questions. They're both really great questions.
Okay.
Okay. real fast to the point around credit hype, because it will actually help us get to answering Brian's question around as well, around the kind of marginal utility of yet more data added to an already overflowing hoard of data, right? And so this concept of credit hype, and again, have to give the laurels and the credit to the people who deserve it. Credit hype comes from this historian of technology, Lee Vinsel, who coined this term specifically to talk about a mode of critiquing technology that takes the claims of the tech sector at face value. So it reads the marketing claims, it looks at the public relations, it looks at the interviews with the executives, and all of the claims that are made around what new capabilities the technology can do, what futures it's going to catapult us into, all of the power that they have, right? It looks at those claims, which are very clearly marketing claims, right? Those are claims meant to hype up something that doesn't exist, right? But it takes those claims at face value and then builds a critique on top of those claims in a way that actually ends up fetishizing and reifying those claims. So making those claims more true, because now it's not only the executives and the investors in the tech industry repeating these claims, it's now also their most ardent critics are repeating these claims. And so it becomes true through repetition by both sides, something that is fundamentally baseless.
Perfect example is AI doomerism, kind of like AI, or the jobs apocalypse line is a perfect example where you have Dario Amodei going, AI could wipe out 30% of jobs, right? Like, and everybody in the media goes, oh no, is the jobs apocalypse coming? But meanwhile, of course, he's selling enterprise AI software whose purpose and pitch is that it's going to automate a lot of jobs, right? And then the media just perpetuates the line, and then it's not real criticism; it's perpetuating the hype.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And so then the criti-hype, the critique that perpetuates the hype, ends up becoming yet another form of marketing for the tech companies, right? And so the danger here is that, and this gets to what I'm trying to do in my book. I kind of lump criti-hype in this what I call an idealist mode of analyzing technology. Idealist, not in the sense that it's optimistic or idealistic, right? But idealist in a philosophical sense of it exists in the mind. It doesn't really have a basis in material reality. It instead exists in the realm of wishes and wants and desires and fears, and in our mind palace, as I put it in the book. Whereas that's criti-hype, right? It's based in our mind, but not necessarily material reality. But I argue in the book that we need a materialist analysis of technology that is fundamentally based in the, what do you actually do? Who do you work for? How do you work, right? Like these real simple interrogative questions that often go unasked, because when we ask, what do you do, rather than going and looking at the technology itself, we look at marketing claims about the technology. That's not going to tell us anything about how the thing actually works or what it actually does in our lives. And so we have to, as critics, as analysts, whether you're critical or not, just as someone who wants to understand these technologies that do have a lot of impact on our lives, society, the economy, our politics, right? If you want to understand these technologies, you have to actually look at the technology, not marketing claims about them. And this actually, I think, loops me back around to Brian's question around the marginal utility of additional data. And the fact of the matter is that the Silicon Valley has always operated quite proudly on a gather first, ask questions later mentality, right? Data is the capital that keeps the tech sector running, and there's an imperative to accumulate as much of that data as possible without really ever knowing if or when or how it's going to be valuable, right? Sometimes they have a sense of like, oh, we need this data because we're doing this thing. But very often, executives, top engineers in Silicon Valley will proudly say, we often build products for the purpose of collecting data so that we can then at some point figure out a way to valorize that data later down the line. And I do a lot of research that focuses on the finance and insurance industry and how they're thinking about technologies and their practices. And I've recently seen a number of thought leaders in these industries talking about how we need to adopt a Silicon Valley mentality of collecting as much data as possible, even if we don't know how or why we're going to use that data. So other executives and thought leaders across other major industries are starting to catch on to this idea that additional data may not actually have marginal utility. It may not have real value, but you don't know unless you collect it. And you don't know that, some unexpected way that extra bit of profiling or that extra bit of personal data may actually power some valuable business line down the road, or it may, be something that you use to create massive machine learning models that nobody really expected that, the data that we were pumping into the internet over the last 30 years was going to be so valuable for creating these massive machine learning models. So in a way, the boom of the AI industry has kind of validated Silicon Valley's own mentality that, see, we told you, you got to collect as much data as you possibly can
Right.
because you never know. It might power the next industrial revolution.
Although, well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting though, because in this particular context, like there's this kind of data that people are then sort of now feeding into the systems again. There's a lot of conversation about how useful that data actually is, because so much of it is of such low quality, or small sentence fragments, or it hasn't been checked. I mean, what they want for data sets really is like rich, novels and journalism, and I mean, you want it all. They're vacuuming up Reddit comment boards and everything too. But there is a fear, right, among, not among us, but among Silicon Valley founders and elites, that this data that's now going in, or too much data, starts to even sort of corrupt or corrode the models after the fact. If it starts the companies could start eating their own tail and then degrading the quality of the output too. So all of this is to say is we are at it. I just think I was kind of bringing all that stuff up to say that we're at this interesting point where, maybe there is utility for all of this data that's like lining ever more data centers that are getting built out in ever more precarious locations. But also, I think, there's a lot of discussion now whether or not some of this sort of starts to collapse in on it itself, both with like the AI systems themselves and economically.
And I think
I was going to say,
the stillborn launch of GPT-5. Sorry, Meilin, you've got Brian and I going now. But I was going to say the stillborn launch of GPT-5 is a real a real exemplar of this, where you create a model that has more parameters than the previous models, built on all of this massive amounts of compute. It's huge amounts of data, right? And what comes out of it is a extremely disappointing product launch, because the marginal improvement between the previous model, 4.0 and 5, was so relatively small and unnoticeable that people were massively disappointed, because it was overhyped that GPT-5 was going to be a meaningful step towards creating God. That's how Sam Altman was talking about it. Yeah. And instead it created a disappointing product launch. How like Silicon Valley.
Well, is that a symptom of that the autophagy, the mad cow autophagy AI that you mentioned in your book? Just like,
yeah, absolutely. So there's a great I start very early in the release of ChatGPT. I saw some of the writing on the wall here around the use of what's called synthetic data, so AI produced data to then train AI models, rather than organic data, right? Human produced data. And there's meaningful differences between organic data and synthetic data. Organic data has a lot more diversity than synthetic data is AI produced data. So there's a lot of kind of, you're replicating what's already in the model and producing that outward, right? And so I coined this term very early on. It was theoretical at the time, what I called Habsburg AI. So kind of an AI model trained on the outputs of other AI models in this very incestuous way. And like the famous Habsburg line, I predicted that it would create these kind of bizarre and grotesque and exaggerated features that incestuous reproduction often does. And then I predict this in a theoretical sense, and then fast forward a couple years later, and there's a number of electrical engineering and computer science researchers who are showing in more technical and empirical senses that this is actually what happens. So there's a group of researchers at Rice University who coined what they called MAD AI, so model autophagia disorder, premised after mad cow disorder, right? Where you have cows eating other cows and producing, diseased beef. Well, in this regard, you have AIs eating other AIs and producing diseased AIs that end up degrading very quickly after a few generations of training from heavily synthetic data sets, where the model itself starts to collapse. And this was a very famous, now very famous, it went very viral paper in Nature talking about this model collapse, also showed in a very empirical and technical sense that depending on if you have a high enough threshold or ratio of synthetic data in your data set, it can cause this model collapse where the AI system starts to hallucinate in these ways that are, just wild tangents going off on not making any sense, starting to fall in on itself and becoming functionally useless as a model. And so my kind of theoretical jab at the AI industry around Habsburg AI, a number of researchers have now shown technically that this is actually what happens. And so for the tech industry, the trillion-dollar question is figuring out how much synthetic data can we use in a data set without triggering catastrophic model collapse. There's no easy or single answer to that, but people like Sam Altman, Dario, CEO of Anthropic, right? They have talked for quite a while now around hyping up synthetic data as the future of AI, because they have essentially drained the internet of useful organic data, as well as having to pay, as Anthropic just recently did, a $1.5 billion settlement in a class action lawsuit brought by 500,000 authors, saying you used our books in a way that was a copyright infringement. And so they're really pinning their hope on synthetic data without people, as the future of AI. But a lot of research is showing that it's not that simple.
Yeah.
So just like the Habsburgs, they just didn't want to marry commoners, and so it's like, well, now you're gonna have to marry your cousin or your brother or whatever. I'm sorry.
That's right. You gotta keep the bloodline pure.
Yeah, gotta keep the bloodline. Keep it. So gross. So to cleanse our palate away from mad cow and the Habsburg AI problems, I'm just curious if you've thought about. I know, Jathan, you mentioned McElroy. Aaron McElroy's work to some degree, and Professor McElroy is one who has sort of initiated different data collection projects, like the worst landlords, or different evidence from, say, renters around the Bay Area in different parts of the United States. And also Professor Anita Sechan wrote a book called Predatory Data, and focusing on eugenicist intentions of data collection, which have been with us for a long time. So whether it's like grassroots activists kind of developing their own data sets for, say, non-terrible purposes, is that something that you've considered? I guess this is a question for either of you. Because certainly the conversation is dominated by what corporate giants do. And like certainly Brian must know, but Jathan, like Santa Cruz is just a hill away from like the valley that is Silicon Valley. So yeah.
Yeah, I'll throw it over to Brian real quick, but just because you mentioned Aaron McElroy's really great work, and I do think that there are a number of examples of thinking about using these forms of data collection for good, and this kind of data science and data analysis for good purposes, right? And so Aaron McElroy is a fantastic geographer whose work I really adore. And they are now a professor at University of Washington up in Seattle, but did their PhD and lived in the Bay Area for a very long time. And while there, founded the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which was crowdsourcing, but also using public records data to try to track which landlords had a track record of evicting their tenants, right? So trying to use this as a way of mapping evictions across the Bay Area and then expanding that out to Seattle and other places as a way to try to use data that for all the ways that we talk about this massive data collection, and the world has become datafied and everything is turned into digital gold or whatever it might be. There's also weirdly lots of kinds of data that are very, very, very hard to access and acquire and analyze and collate, and that just weirdly often happens to be data that people in power don't want you to have. So data about evictions, for example. Well, landlords, especially in the Bay Area, don't want you to have access to that kind of data. Aaron has also co-founded a group called Landlord Tech Watch, which is crowdsourcing information about the kinds of landlord technologies, rent tech, surveillance tech used in housing, as well as people, tenants' experiences dealing with these technologies. And again, for all the information we have about technology out there, weirdly, we don't have good databases about the kinds of surveillance tech that are being used on people who are the most marginal and disempowered groups in society. And so there are lots of great examples of data for good projects, right? But it also is the case that very often those projects are not getting huge amounts of investment by venture capital, right? I could not go to A16Z and say, I have a great project, I have a great AI startup that's going to track and hold to account landlords across the Bay Area. A16Z would not be giving me a $1 billion valuation for that startup.
Where's that unicorn, Jathan? Where's that unicorn?
So it really reveals as well that Silicon Valley kind of speaks out of both sides of their mouth here, where they say that data is the future, AI is the future, everything is data, everything needs AI injected into it. And then if you were to propose some kind of data project or AI startup that actually undermined their own interest and wealth and power, they would say, well, we're not that kind of data, not that kind
That's
of
going
AI.
too far.
But I'm sure, I know Brian has a lot of other great examples as well. And it might not be a super data science forward project, but I do want to highlight Brian's great series on, AI Took My Job, right? The kind
I'm
of
reading
tracking the actual impacts here of AI on labor, which are not as rose-colored as some might say, but nor are they so simply dystopian as others may say. It's a lot more complicated.
I want to ask, where can people find you and what do you have coming up?
Yeah, this was wonderful conversation. Thank you both for facilitating it, and Jathan, always a pleasure to meet in real and digital spaces. Perhaps we should shout out. It's on theme. There's a Luddite conference being held, the first of its kind at Columbia University in November. Perhaps we can throw the details to that in the show notes if you happen to be there. I think the main conference is open to all. But most of my writing these days is at my newsletter, which is also called Blood in the Machine. And it's where I'm carrying out my AI Killed My Job project and just my ongoing coverage of labor and power in Silicon Valley. Thanks again for having me. This was great.
Thanks so much, Brian.
A real joy. I'll do my plugs now. And yes, Brian and I will both be at this conference called neo-Luddism, Technology and Resistance in the Modern Workplace on November 7th in Columbia University in New York City, organized by some great grad students and labor organizers at the university. So that'll be a lot of fun. For me, you can find my book, The Mechanic and the Luddite, A Ruthless Criticism of Technology and Capitalism. If you want to hear me speak more in your ears, I do that every week at my podcast, This Machine Kills, which I co-host with Ed Anguissa Jr. and produced by Jeremy Brown. And we talk a lot about the political economy of technology. So these kinds of conversations, and I think those are the two big areas that you can find me. I'm on Blue Sky as well at my name, and so those are the places to read and listen to me.
Join us on the first and third Mondays of each month for a Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills at 6 p.m.
The Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills team includes Amy Chen Mills, Nyanko Nyasu, Meilin Obanada,
Joy Shandel-Decker, along with Todd Zimmerman of Nativerse Studios.
Thanks for joining us on KSQD 90.7 FM in Santa Cruz and 89.5 and 89.7 KSQT FM in Prunedale, California.